In contemporary philosophy, the problem of consciousness has raised, you might say, its irrepressible head again and is demanding for explanation. It's only, I think, in 1995, the quote that you see here was published in a paper by this philosopher by name Chalmers, who reanimated the entire discussion around consciousness. So in this talk, we'll briefly consider some of the top-level arguments as to why consciousness is, as a thing to be explained, very different from almost everything that science has dealt with. We'll look at the theosophical perspective, and we'll finally end with, as much as possible, normative things that we can take away and implement in our life. Before we begin, we have to explain a thing that is in front of us. The word used for that which demands to be explained is explicandum. Let's first look at a few explicandums that science has dealt with over the ages. And then we'll come to the quintessential explicandum, which is that of consciousness. Let's first look at life principle. How life principle as an explicandum has been dealt with by science, by ancients. Let's start with how life principle was conceived of as a concept in pre-scientific era, let's say pre-20th century. The ancients all universally believed in the ontological existence of a vital principle. We see this in almost every tradition. In India, we obviously have prana. It's not just defined as an ontological concept. There is a lot of explanation as to how it animates various creatures. We are told there are 5 pranas. There are nadis through which they travel. They each have their own functions. You will see here that first an ontological presupposition is made. For us, it's a presupposition. For them, the direct seers, they perceived it as a reality. And then they talked about all the functions that it is able to perform. We see this in Sufi tradition as ruh, pneuma of the Greeks, chi, nephesh, although nephesh has a dual meaning, one of the meanings is of the life element. Anauki, Egyptians, and so on and so forth. You see the Ankt, which is a symbol universally in Egyptian hieroglyphics. When you fast forward all the way to as late as the 16th century, you see Paracelsus talking about archeus, which is the universally diffused life principle or life essence. And mumia, he talks about as the instantiation of that in man as a life principle. He, Paracelsus, saw these things as realities, as we see things around us as realities, and was able to effect miraculous cures through this knowledge. HBB in SD talks about Paracelsus in very high, holds him in very high regard. She, in a place in, I think, SD1, talks about Paracelsus as being an occultist in Europe, who, if not for his untimely death, would have left behind more than one occult truths that would have prevailed in Europe. You go to the 17th century, you see Conatus of Spinoza. Descartes also used a similar concept to explain vitalism. And you'll see the reason everybody in the history have endeavored to explain vitalism, because the difference between an alive organism and a dead organism for anybody who witnesses the transformation is so stark. It is clear that something has left that organism. Works in 19th century, as late as the 19th century, had this concept of elan vital principle. Okay, what did science do? Right, in the post-scientific era, we'll call this post-Darwinian era. Life principle now is essentially a set of characteristics that life displays, the phenomenology of life. We see reproduction, we've kind of basically reduced life into its characteristics: reproduction, homeostasis, the maintenance of internal state, evolution, growth, energy, adaptation, heredity, metabolism. We've basically taken the characteristics of life, the behaviors of life. This is the first reductionism. We've reduced it to the behaviors. Each of these behaviors are explained by its own explanations. Each of them become an explicandum in itself, and they're all explained in some way as to why it behaves this way. And then the principle of life, which was your primary question, what is life, is said to be the emergent concept of these functions, which in itself doesn't have reality, doesn't hold ontological reality. Science doesn't admit of a life principle. It just says life is an umbrella term we use for all of these behaviors that you see. We've kind of inverted the problem. If you'll see, the question we asked was, what is life? And the answer you got was, here's all the behaviors that you see of life. And life, as you thought was something that existed, doesn't really exist. It is the emergent property. It is the emergent concept. It is a mental construction of that you are able to produce because you're seeing all this behavior. You think there is something there, but really it doesn't exist. Let's look at another example. Forces of nature. How did the ancients or the pre-scientific era people look at forces of nature? In the Hermetic philosophy, there is the concept of Azoth. We see this in Isis. HPB explains that it is the universal magical agent, astral light. Physical science knows it as heat, light, electricity, and magnetism. In SD, we see the forms at origo of all forces, right, being defined in absolute terms. And from that absolute, through many gradations, if you will, the genealogy of how it then arrives at astral light on our plane and displays itself as heat, light, electricity, and magnetism. Azoth of the Hermetics. In Vishnu Purana, Sankhya, you see this explained as ether, and from ether, as a telescopic outward projection, you see air and its rudimentary sense, fire, its rudimentary sense, and so on and so forth. So the first postulate is made of Mahat investing itself in Ahankara and the tamasic element of the Ahankara producing ether with its rudimentary sense, sound, and the presiding deity. So there's also an ontological sense. And that, because there are rudimentary senses associated with primordial elements. In this plane, the senses go out to their corresponding elementary um, manifestations and is able to sense it. So in a way, you define light as the capacity of the rudimentary sense manifesting itself as a physical sense of sight, reaching out and looking at the fiery rudimentary element or the um, primordial element in its compound sense. So in a way, force is explained in this way, that there is rudimentary element or primordial elements associated with its corresponding rudimentary senses, and the transmission between them is how it was explained. In fact, if you come down to the 19th century science itself, ether, although as a concept evolved quite uh, dramatically, was still held on to have some ontological existence. The science of 19th century postulated the existence, the real existence of ether as a ever diffused field that existed with which is invisible but had infinite tenuous nature, so that you could define light, heat, gravity as essentially disturbances in nature. So it was seen both as a means and agent of transmission as well as the origin, because the disturbance essentially was started from ether. So you'll see that when you talk about what are the forces of nature, pre-scientific era, there were ontological explanations. We said there is such a thing as azat, there is such a thing as mahat and egotism, and from it ether and so on and so forth, and the entire descent of that into physical matter. Ether of 19th century still postulated ontological existence in which forces correlated. What happened now? We have four fundamental forces in physics. And what are these forces? These are behaviors of force. We say that gravity is one force. There's weak nuclear, there's strong nuclear, and electromagnetic forces. What is this? These are behaviors we have observed, right? And that behavior, each behavior is explained in its own right. Gravity has its own equations and its own set of explanations. And every one of these fundamental forces have their own explanations as to why it behaves this way. And then we ask the question, what is force? Oh, such a thing as force does not exist. These behaviors exist. The force is simply a mental construct that we have as an emergent umbrella property for describing these disparate behaviors. This Chalmers calls, in his paper, bait and switch. He doesn't exactly call it bait and switch for this, but the extension of his argument applies. What is bait and switch? It's an American term. Basically, you bait, meaning you say that you're going to answer an ontological question, and you switch your explanation to a functional explanation. Somebody asks, what is life? You say, oh, these are the characteristics of life. I'll explain each one of them. What is force? Are there four forces? I'll explain each of them. There's no such thing as force. There's no such thing as life. What is the order in which, let's analyze this in a little bit more detail. First, there is this reductionism, right? First, you ask, what is an explicandum? Immediately, it is reduced to its constituent characteristics. Immediate reductionism. Then there is this emergent hypothesis, meaning the explicandum itself doesn't exist ontologically, but it is adventitious, meaning it comes about through external forces, adventitious, emergent concept, emergent hypothesis. You take an ontological question and essentially provide a functional explanation. All of this is essentially rooted in this utilitarian bias. Science is not interested in answering truths and realities as they are. They're interested in functional explanations. What is the immediate physical utility of an explanation? If I tell you life is elan vitae, the one that we talked about, elan vital, elan vitae, how can you immediately use it? Or if you use Paracelsus' definition of mumia, unless you are an occultist, you cannot directly use it. So science made this utilitarian bias. How can I use the explanations that I get? What is the technological implementation of the explanations? So a lot of this comes from this utilitarian bias. Why do we explain functionality? Because functions can be used to manipulate nature for the advantage, physical advantages that man can derive from it. The ontological explanations don't give you that, although that is the real question being asked. In this functional explanations, the mathematical model becomes the explicandum. So when I ask the question, what is life? And you give me all of these characteristics and some equations that tell you why all of those characteristics behave that way. Those equations themselves become explicandum. So we'll look at a few of these examples. If I ask the question, what is light? The equivalent, it's somewhat facetious here, but the equivalence of what science does to the question, what is light, is to say, this is light. This, by the way, is Maxwell's equations of light, only when it behaves as a wave. There's the particle wave duality, but the functional explanations is equivalent to this exact way. It may seem facetious to us, but that's what is happening. When you ask what is light, here's the behavior of light. Does it tell you what light is? You ask what is gravity? You say this is gravity as a field. This is the field equation from Einstein's general theory of relativity. Does it tell you what gravity is? And you ask what is life? And you say this is life, which is the idea of the selfish gene. So what we have done is essentially done a bait and switch. We have baited people into saying that we'll answer an ontological question and switched our answers to functional explanations. It doesn't stop, by the way. We took the example of physics, biology. It even goes into psychology. We recently had a talk about free will, where the same thing was explained as the scientific standpoint. You ask, what is free will? And the explanation is, there are some unconscious brain processes using some prediction algorithms. I can tell you what decision you're going to make before you even become aware of them. So those biological processes, which are the behavior you see, is what is making the decision. Free will is an illusion. It doesn't exist. Exact same thing. Even though you feel so innately that you have free will, scientists have the audacity to say, no, that's an illusion. What you're feeling is an illusion. It actually doesn't exist. So this ontological denial of the explicandum and reducing it to the behaviors and explaining the behaviors and baiting and switching has gone up to psychological levels. But this is where it fails. That's why it's the hard problem. Let's try to apply this mode of explanation, scientific mode of explanation, to consciousness. So what is the first thing you do? Somebody asks, what is consciousness? You say, what is the phenomenology of consciousness? What are the things that consciousness, what is the behaviors you see of conscious organisms? And you'll see, and this list also comes from a very detailed study of consciousness, behavior and phenomenology of consciousness. Information integration. So let's say I'm looking at this table. I'm getting sensory input of this table. Visual input, I'm getting tactile input. Maybe if I go close enough, I can get some olfactory input. Right, and I tap it, I get auditory input. But these are all disparate sources. There's something in my consciousness that is integrating all of this information, bringing about the idea of this table in my mind. That is information integration. That's one behavior that you see. Also, HPP calls this apperception. You are able to take that integrated information, discriminate based on it. I can say this is a table because I've seen other tables of this sort. I'm able to categorize it, and I'm able to react to the stimuli. I can say I can keep my computer on it. That's a reaction to the stimuli. I can report on this internal cognitive state. I can tell you, I think this is a table. So I'm reflectively reporting on an internal cognitive state. I can focus my attention on it, or I can focus my attention on the audience where this will not even be in my field of vision. So consciousness has this ability to selectively focus attention, and I'm able to regulate my voluntary behavior around the table. This is the phenomenology of consciousness. It's not an exhaustive list, but there is a finite list. Now, I can take every one of those behavior, every one of the functions of consciousness, and use the hardware definition of neural pathways. I can use fMRI images. I can use all kinds of brain scanning technology to show you how that behavior is being implemented at the level of neurons. I can take a more abstract approach and tell you computationally how I'm doing it. The question is, you've taken consciousness and you've reduced it. Now, let's admit, this is not true though, that every one of the behavior we see isn't fully explained in neural pathways and computational mechanics, but let's assume and grant that it can be explained. It is within the epistemological framework of science. So it will eventually be able to explain it. Let's even grant that. Even if all mechanical explanations for all functional aspects of consciousness is explained, can we now say consciousness is an adventitiously emergent concept with no basis in reality, as we've said about life, as we've said about forces, as we've said about free will? Can we say that about consciousness? That consciousness really doesn't exist. It is an illusory concept that is coming out of these functions that are happening. The answer is no. Why? Because consciousness is immanent, immanent with an A, not an I, meaning it is innate. It is here in front of me. It is indubitable. No matter what reasoning you give me, all of that reasoning is happening inside consciousness. So if those reasoning is denying the very thing in which it is happening, it is absurd. Consciousness is immanent, so you cannot deny it. The reductionist argument, the functional explanations, and the emergent hypothesis that work for everything fails for consciousness. Why? Because I know it exists. You cannot deny it. It is indubitable. The scientist making all of his arguments is making it in his consciousness. Without that, he couldn't be making it. To say, for example, that I am not conscious, to say, okay, are you aware that you're not conscious? Yes, I'm aware I'm not conscious. That's why I'm saying it. Then you're saying, I am conscious of the fact that I'm not conscious, which is ad absurdum. You are conscious. That's why you're saying these things. It is like saying, I don't exist. Who is saying you don't exist? You. It reduces to a paradox. It becomes absurd. Consciousness is immanent. It is indubitable. It is the one thing that you cannot be unsure about. It is the only thing, in fact, that you can be sure about from a Cartesian perspective. So this reductive methods of science fails when it comes to consciousness. There is what they call an explanatory gap. So if you take the integral of all constituent functions of consciousness, it doesn't explain consciousness. And the way Chalmers put it is, why is the performance of functions accompanied by experience? Meaning experience in the sense is something it feels like to be me. They also call it qualia. only I can know how it feels like to be me, and only you know how it feels like to be you. That experience exists. Everybody has that experience. But that experience is not explained by explaining every function. All of these functions could have happened in darkness with unconsciousness. But why are the lights on? Why do I have experience? That is the explanatory gap. To explain this a little bit further, we should consider what is called the Turing test. Alan Turing, was is the father of modern computing. He came up with this test. He essentially said that if you, in modern phraseology, are chatting with two entities, one of it is an actual human being on the other end, the other is a language model, some AI program. If you can ask each a series of questions, if you cannot tell which is a human being and which is an algorithm, the algorithm passes the Turing test. If a human being cannot tell if they're talking to a conscious, sentient human being on the other end, or an algorithm, it passes the Turing test. That was the Turing test, that you cannot tell the difference. Now you may ask, because consciousness is so innate in us, it is very hard for us to conceptualize what it means for all the functions of consciousness to go on without there being experience. To understand that, we have to look at the Chinese room argument that is made. Let's take the Turing test. Let's say we built this AI model that passes the Turing test, which, by the way, is a distinct possibility. So last year, there was an engineer in Google who was working on their large language model. Like all engineers, he was working late into the night and he was testing it out. Basically, he was chatting with it. At some point, he stopped. He was flabbergasted. He, in great dismay, ran out of the Google campus, went home, and proclaimed to the world that this program is sentient. It is conscious. Whatever interaction he had with this program, it was so real that he said it is conscious, that it would be unethical for him to terminate the program. If he sent a kill -9 signal to it, it would be like killing a sentient being. He had moral dilemmas about it. And he was on the verge of mental agony, and Google promptly fired him, of course. If somebody is saying the AI program is sentient, they said, no, you need help. But such is the advance that an engineer, a Google engineer, I mean, to get into Google as an engineer, you have to be in the top, I don't know, 0.1% of education and intelligence, couldn't tell the difference, thought it was sentient. So let's actually make this argument. It's called the Chinese room argument. Let's take that AI program, whatever this person thought was sentient. Let's say it passes the Turing test. There is no way to distinguish its output from a human's output, right? What you can do, let's say that language model is in Chinese language, not English, Chinese. As in, if you ask it Chinese questions, it will reply in Chinese. The model doesn't care which language it is, it can be trained in any language. Let's say it's a Chinese large language model. And any AI model, ML model, is essentially simply mathematical statements and some procedure encoded in a Turing complete language. It is simply procedures and mathematics. I, as a human being, can look at it, commit it to memory, and execute it in my head. It is possible to do that. Let's say I do that. Here's the Chinese room argument. The person in blue is me, and that's the program that's running in my head on the left-hand side of the screen. The right-hand side, the person in purple, is a Chinese person who understands Chinese. This person asks a question. They write some Chinese characters, let's say, or type some Chinese characters. I look at it and I start executing this program. I say, oh, if there is a dash that is horizontal of 2 pixels wide, then do this, run some mathematical formula if that is greater than some. I'm just running all of that. And then it tells me what to do. It will tell me, okay, start your pen from 0.00 and draw a pixel, 2 pixels width, do this, do this. I do all of that and I produce some Chinese characters. This person who understands Chinese will be like, oh my God, I'm talking to a sentient human being who understands Chinese on the other end. But for me, I executed the whole thing. I appeared as if I was speaking Chinese and I was sentient, but I didn't understand a word. I didn't understand anything. I had no experience. This is executing the functions of consciousness without being conscious of it. This kind of gives you somewhat of a surreal example, illustration of what it means for there to be functions of consciousness without the lights being on. Because for us, consciousness is so innate, it's very hard for us to extricate ourselves and think about it. Chinese room problem tells you that the functions don't give you consciousness. Consciousness, there is an explanatory gap. Not only is there an explanatory gap, there is also a conceptual gap. And you look at it this way. Let's take a tree. When you look at a tree, what do you see? You immediately come up with, it's green, it's tall, it grows from the ground towards the sky, it's in some park. All of these are some properties that you see of the tree. Then you get some subjective ideas about the tree. Positive ideas can be it's majestic, it's inviting. If you're a shopkeeper and the tree is blocking you, you say it's blocking my view, it's reducing my footfall. If it's growing in front of your house, you'd say, oh, it's digging up my foundation. These are all secondary, qualitative assessments of what you're seeing. The primary properties, the green, tall, on the ground, and the secondary properties are all happening in your head. It is mental. The tree, we are supposing, is extra mental. It is outside your mental domain. It's in some extra mental physical domain. We call the first set the primary properties, and the secondary properties, the qualitative, the secondary properties. Now, if I ask the question to this audience, what is objective and what is subjective? What would you say? You'll likely say everything to the right of the dotted line is objective and everything to the left is subjective. But you'd be wrong. The reality is that the primary attributes, the primary properties are what are objective. The tree may not even exist. You have no way of validating that the tree exists. Why are the primary properties objective? Because they exist in interpersonal space or intersubjective space. I can bring all of you in front of the tree and we'll all see the same primary properties. Just because we all agree that the tree exists doesn't mean it exists in reality, in actuality, outside the extra mental physical reality. So what is objective is the phenomenology of the tree being there or perhaps being there, which is a mental phenomenon. And the secondary properties are subjective. So what is objective and subjective is actually completely in the mental domain. Now, if you take this view, where does science operate? Science operates in this primary properties box. Science has no way of looking at extra material, extra mental, physical reality. It just postulates that such a thing exists. That what you see as primary properties is in fact existing in reality is a leap of faith. In fact, Descartes, who came up with this Cartesian divide, said the following. He said that's huge, too big a leap of faith to assume that the primary properties actually exist in physical reality. And you know how he bridged the gap? He postulated the existence of a benevolent God. He said God is benevolent. And that's why, as a creator, he made sure my primary properties faithfully matched reality. Spinoza took it even further, and in fact, maybe closer to the theosophical viewpoint, which is that he said, only from the godly vision or the vision, faultless vision, what he called godly vision, can you actually see reality? Can you see extra material? That outside of that, everything is primary properties that are in the mental domain. How does science operate when it comes to consciousness? You have to postulate that there is some extra mental brain That is the basis from which the emergent property of consciousness is coming, right? But does that brain actually exist? No. Science is operating in this primary box, which is a mental domain. And what is supporting the mental domain? Consciousness. Why do you have this mental domain at all? The underlying foundation of mental domain is consciousness. So in a way, you cannot explain consciousness by appealing to consciousness. Meaning, it's like saying, somebody comes and says, explain to me what paper is. And you'll say, okay, first take paper, recycle it, it becomes paper. It's like you cannot explain paper by appealing to paper. You cannot explain consciousness by the foundation of consciousness. You're only operating in the mental domain of primary properties. You're postulating there's extramental, but that's a bridge too far, even for Descartes and Spinoza. So it's a bridge too far for science. It's an assumption. It may not be true. You could have probably brought somebody with faultless or somebody with in a higher state of consciousness in front of a tree, and they would likely not see a tree. They will see all the life atoms it is made of, and they'd probably see things that you don't see. And they'll say the tree is just a lower level reality. I see higher level realities. They may not even see the tree. So it's not that consensus in a small group of people tells you that the extramental reality exists. It is just the primary properties. And so consciousness runs into this exact problem. Every other explicandum doesn't run into this problem. Because it's okay, you can say the primary properties reflect faithfully the extramental. But when you come to consciousness, you run into this problem that your explicandum is part of the explanation. It can never be removed out of the explanation. So we looked at two problems here. One was the explanatory gap, functions, experience. There's a gap between them. Then we looked at the conceptual gap, which is you cannot explain consciousness without some basis in consciousness. So what does theosophy say about all of these three things? The first fundamental proposition gives us the very source, the very, I would say, the highest conceivable point of the origin of individual consciousness. We start from the absolute and its three aspects. And we say this metaphysical triad, which is the three aspects of the absolute, as the root from which proceeds all manifestation. The great breadth assumes the character of pre-cosmic ideation. It is the fons et origo of force and of all individual consciousness, and supplies the guiding intelligence in the vast scheme of cosmic evolution. This is the beginning. From the absolute down through anthropological evolutions to this fifth race and the individual consciousness that we have. It's the entire origin and the genealogy of where it exists today. Next, we might ask, okay, this is individual consciousness, but what about consciousness all around? And here in page 127, we see that there is no plane in the whole universe with a wider margin, wider field of action, and it's almost endless gradations of perceptive and apperceptive qualities than this is talking about the mental, materiality, mental plane, which has in its turn an appropriate smaller plane for every form, from the mineral monad to the time that the monad blossoms forth by evolution into the divine monad. So essentially, there is a certain pan-psychic argument being made that consciousness is innate, fundamental property of the manifested universe. And every manifestation has some degree of consciousness, some degree of mentality in its own plane. Lastly, we come to this conceptual divide, and it's so clearly explained here that as long as the contrast of subject and object endures, to wit, as long as we enjoy our five senses and no more, we do not know how to divorce our all-perceiving ego, the higher self, from the thraldom of these senses. So long will it be impossible for the personal ego to break through the barrier which separates it from the knowledge of things in themselves, substance. So the extra-mental postulate that we made, substance, the primary properties matter, is how it is distinguished in ST. Matter, or the primary properties, come about by the confluence of the noumena and consciousness, right? It is the confluence of the two. And as long as this individualized consciousness is in the thraldom of the five senses, it is not able to escape and look at things as they are. We've said, until it merges itself in the all and in that nirvanic state, look at things as they are. Until then, you don't see substance as it is. So in summary, the problems are as follows. Consciousness breaks scientific epistemology. So reductionism, taking an ontological question, reducing it to its functional, behavioral constituents, explaining the functions, and then making an emergent hypothesis, breaks. There is an explanatory gap. Even if you explain all the functions of consciousness, you still don't explain experience, the quintessence of consciousness. Meaning, why is there experience that accompanies the performance of functions? Then there is the conceptual gap, which is, for consciousness, you are forced to use the explicandum in the explanation. It becomes a conceptual gap. Now, from a theosophical standpoint, how do we address it? Individual consciousness is simply an instantiation of universal consciousness. It is a fundamental property of the universe, not adventitiously emergent, meaning it hasn't come about by external forces all acting together and something comes out of it. That, like they explain with free will, is an illusion. Hence, all manifestation is conscious on its own plane. This is kind of a form of panpsychism. And finally, that the goal and destiny of every individual consciousness is to merge back into its universal parent. And how do you do that? The means to that goal is the dissipation of this idea of separateness from the stage of self-conscious manhood, through self-devised, self-induced efforts, through self-sacrifice. This is the theosophical standpoint and explanation. Now, this is somewhat of a descriptive summary. We might almost always try to end on takeaways that are normative. How do you take some of what we've learned today and apply it to our daily lives? What are things that can change our behavior by what we've considered today? One, I would say that the modern age is simply enamored by scientific progress. We just feel like there's so much explanation that science has given that we feel it is explained literally everything, right? And there is we're somewhat enamored by that progress. And we're taken in by the utilitarian value of it through technology and things like that. But when you look at this conceptual gap of where science operates, it is still in the mental domain. So from an epistemic primacy perspective, is there such a thing as objective, bare things as they are in themselves? It's only a postulate. The mental plane is what takes epistemic primacy. It is within that science is operating. So there is epistemic primacy of consciousness, of the subjective planes. And so the contemplative traditions of Eastern schools takes a epistemic primacy because that's where you're operating. You just by postulating that the primary properties inhere in reality, you're shifting the primacy to the other side. But that is an inversal of epistemic primacy. So contemplative traditions take more of an importance in this role. Once you say that, there is relative unimportance of material progress. When you say the goal, the means are all on the contemplative side, that the postulates of physical reality are simply a bridge too far for almost all philosophers age old. And when you consider it for yourself, it may not actually even exist. What you are dealing with is contemplative traditions. And there it becomes the material realities become relatively unimportant. What that leads to, in a way, is what Gandhi actually ended up with. You will see, why has Gandhi been discarded in modern times? It is because of this scientific progress, the utilitarian value of it, people being taken up by that, right? But when you deconstruct all of that, you see that science is actually standing on very shaky foundation, and the reality of your existence is on the subjective side or the contemplative side, and the progress is on that end. So everything else is simply a side issue in that sense. So Gandhi clearly saw this, and that's why he recommended and he advocated for, non-mechanized, manual labor intensive agrarian communities, interdependence. Those are the realities that you're dealing with, which is community, interdependence, the ability of governing yourself through swarajya, meaning you are truly independent in your thought, truly independent in uh, in your progress in this contemplative traditions, right? That the physical realities of you having some conveniences around you is completely unimportant, and in fact detrimental to that progress. So I'll end with this quote that Gandhi had, which is that simplicity is the essence of universality. Essentially, the goal is to, as we looked at it in the theosophical viewpoint, to transcend this sense of separateness and approach universality. And simplicity is the essence of that. The complexities of what we have generated around us through this scientific quote unquote progress is in fact detrimental to that progress. And so by hopefully looking at this problem of consciousness against which science is now abutting, we are able to discover the foundational weaknesses of science. We are able to show there are gaps that are just insurmountable through the epistemological frameworks of science. And so we can disconnect ourselves from the thraldom, if you will, to use the same sense, of this obsession with technology and scientific progress and these explanations, and go back to our roots in contemplative tradition. And to do that, simplicity is the essence of universality. We'll leave it there and open the floor up for any comments or questions.